Hello, welcome to a very exciting creature tutorial. In this tutorial, we are going to cover the basics about secondary motion, why you need it, and how you can use it to enhance and liven up your animations. Okay, so I have an animation here of a raptor dinosaur running, and as you can see, it's rather lifelike, right? It looks pretty cool, really lively, and you would say from a casual observer, you would say it looks almost like it was actually breathing with a lot of character and life. And why is that? Well, other than the basic motions of the legs and maybe say the head slightly bobbing around, you can see a lot of what we call secondary effects going on in the character. In particular, if you looked at the tail, you can see the tail. Actually, let me stop the animation. Let me turn on the bones. If you see the tail, you can see that the bones are wobbling slightly, but they're not just wobbling randomly. They're actually wobbling in accordance to the overall motion of the character. What do I mean by that? I mean they're actually driven. They actually coincide, or they're in sync. They're almost like driven by the overall root motion of the character. And similarly, you can see the flesh here is wobbling as well. It's in rhythm to the bouncing gait of the dinosaur, and so is the crown, and so are the so-called wings or hands of the dinosaur as well. Okay, so that's secondary motion, but what's the actual definition of secondary motion before we continue? So if we pop up Wikipedia, we see that secondary motion also also known as secondary animation is used to refer to flat motions that are generated as a reaction to the movement of primary motion of a character. Now this is very important. It's generated by the primary movement of the character. So it's generated by the overall direction, the overall movement, overall, say, acting motion of the character. Now it is significant in animation because it amplifies the character's motion via effects that appear to be driven by motion. So it makes the character's motion seem a lot more natural. And examples of secondary motion include rippling water, swish of cloak, or jiggle of body parts from a person that is moving. So it has many degrees of freedom. It's actually quite complex, right? So one example would be cloth or flesh, which moves in a whole bunch of different ways that will be really difficult to keyframe. And so it's difficult to hand animate secondary motion. It's typically done by computer software. Well, thankfully you have Creature. So secondary motion in Creature is literally child's play. It's super simple, but you have to understand the concepts, and that's what the point of this tutorial is. So I'm going to go through a couple of real-life examples, characters like this dinosaur and more. We're going to go through each of them step by step, and we're going to apply secondary motion to them to bring the character to life. So I hope you enjoy this tutorial, and let's dive in. Okay, so I have a new clip of the dinosaur over here, and it's called no secondary because there's no secondary motion. I've removed all the secondary motion from the character, and you can see it's quite different, right? So there's the primary motion of the character, the leg motion, and the slight bobbing of the head, and maybe the slight tilting of the wing. But that's all using the rotate cycle motors or the smooth IK rotate motors. But you can also keyframe them as well. That's not the focus of this tutorial. This tutorial is to amplify the base directional motion, the base motion that we have, amplify it with secondary motion to bring the character alive, right? So typically you get to this stage, you've animated most of the core actions, if you will, if I call it core actions of the character. So it does whatever it's supposed to do. It's doing a running gait. And then you think, what's next? Well, it still looks kind of stiff, right? So let's start adding secondary motion to this character in Creature. And as you can see, it's very simple, actually really fun as well. So I'll stop the animation. Now, the first thing we're going to do is, I think the most apparent problem with this animation is the tail of the animation is very, very stiff. It's not actually moving in accordance to the character. It just seems like a single straight stiff pole, and we're going to change that. It should be a dynamic fleshy tail, right? Okay, so what we do is we will actually change the tail into a physics type object by using the bend physics motor. So what you can do is you can click on the root, or not the root, sorry, the base tailbone. If you press Ctrl+M, select all the children, but you can see these are also children of that. So if I select this instead and go Ctrl+N, it's fine. I'll select these tailbones. But on the other hand, if I don't want to do that, I can also select the child, the smallest child of this tailbone, and then walk up the chain by pressing Ctrl+N. Okay, so that's easy. Or you can just hand select them by holding down the Control. Right, but I typically like using the shortcut key, so I just press Ctrl+N to walk up the chain. So now I have these bones over here selected. I'll click Install Motor, and I select Bend Physics Motor. That's the magic, so click on that. Okay, now play it. So you can see it goes slightly crazy. So why is that? Okay, we need to understand the nature of using physics motors in Creature. They're a very powerful concept, but you have to understand how to control them. Right. So on the right, you're going to see a bunch of parameters in the physics motor. Right. So you can see the damping, and then I'll tell you the ones that you really should care about. So the ones you really should care about are damping, and maybe gravity, and stiffness, and stretch stiffness. The problem right now, if we play it again, is that there's too much energy being generated through the system. It's wobbling a bit too much. So what you want to do is you want to calm the system down. And what you typically do is you want to bleed more energy into the system. And so you just increase the damping. So let's try 15 and see what we get. Aha, you see it's a bit calmer now. And we can calm it down even more by saying 25, for example. And immediately you get a much calmer motion, right? It bleeds more energy. Okay, if you want a bit more life to it, you reduce the amount of energy that's bled from the system, and you get a livelier tail. Okay, so that's how much energy it bleeds, but you can also control how stiff the tail actually is, and that will be the stiffness parameter. There's two of them. There's the stiffness and the stretch stiffness. Now, stiffness itself is how easily it bends. So if you want a tail that's not very bendy, then you increase the stiffness. If you want a tail that doesn't stretch that much under gravity, it stretches linearly, then you increase the stretch stiffness. Let's play with the stiffness for now. So I'm going to try, if you click on the pencil icon, it actually gives you a hint as well, so it's very useful. Let's try a 100 and see what we get. Right. So you can see it's stiffer now, but it also wobbles a bit more. This is typical of all physics systems. So if you were to increase the stiffness parameter of any system, you should also typically increase the damping as well in unison to basically get the effect you want, right? So I can up the stiffness to say 200. And now you can see it's a very stiff tail, right? It still wobbles with secondary effects, but now it's a lot stiffer, as opposed to me decreasing the stiffness back to 50. And I should also, as I said, take down the damping, say to maybe 15. Okay, and you can see the angles that it wobbles, right? It bends is a lot higher because it's actually less stiff. So let's take the value up to say, I don't know, 150. And you can see it tries to keep the bending angles, and then we up the damping to say 20. Okay, maybe more if you want less motion. Or maybe even more, 35. There you go. So now you have a comma secondary motion on the tail. And you can keep playing with this, as I said. You can keep playing with these values. If I put a value of 42, it's even comma. So now you actually have a nice secondary effect on the tail going on right now. And that's pretty cool. Remember, we've only done this with a bunch of clicks. Installing a bend physics motor on the chain of bones over here. Right? We did an install bend physics on the chain of bones. We tweaked the damping and the stiffness parameters, and that was it. And we get free secondary effects. It's really cool. And so you can see how much time it saves. You don't have to hand animate these effects anymore. Okay, let's continue this exercise. Let's do this for the even more challenging parts. So typically people will think of secondary motion for tails, right? That's really obvious. But you can also do secondary motion for other parts of the body which don't even seem that obvious. So one of them is the flesh of the character. Now I can actually add in some secondary effects. I'm going to add in some secondary effects to the flesh of the character so it actually wobbles with it when it moves. So I'm going to select these two bones. Okay, you notice these two bones are conveniently rigged and placed in a chain along the flesh of the character and weighted. Right. So I'm going to select these two bones. I'm going to install again the bend physics, and let's see what we get. So you get a very funny effect. It's wobbling a bit too much, but again, let's apply the same principles in practice. First things first, we're going to increase the stiffness, maybe say, I don't know, 200. And immediately, see, once you stiffen it up, you get an effect that is, you get some secondary effects, but you also get something that isn't as crazy, right? So you get some nice wobbly motion. Maybe I can reduce it to say 100. See what we get. Maybe too much. Okay, so 150. Okay, still too much. So maybe 200. And you can see how Creature aids you in iteration time. It's super easy. You just put these parameters in, and you can get basically a very nice secondary effect within a couple seconds. And this saves you all the hand animation time. Okay, so now we have secondary effects on the flushes here. We're going to do secondary effects here as well. So let's do it for the flesh here. Same deal. Wobbling too much. Let's up the stiffness to say 150. Right, so now you actually see that we have the flesh here wobbling. Right, okay, so we have the flesh here wobbling, we have the tail here wobbling. What else do we need? Well, I think we do need some maybe secondary effects on the wing. Agree? So let's do it. So again, same deal. Select up the chain, install bend physics to wobbly. Let's up the stiffness to say 150, the bending stiffness. And there you go. That's pretty cool. So we have secondary effects now on the wing, the flesh, the tail. It's been a really short time, but we have some pretty cool results already. Let's do it for the final part, the crown. So again, 3 bones, install, bend physics, play. It's too crazy. Up the stiffness. There you go. Up the damping, probably. Okay. And then lastly, turn off the bones, and let's see the final result. There you go. So we have actually achieved some pretty amazing secondary effects with a couple of physics motors very, very easily in Creature, and that demonstrates the power of the procedural motor system in Creature. But in addition to that, I hope you've gained an appreciation of why you need secondary motion in your characters. It really brings your character to life. You can actually see this character as a much more viable, I would say viable, a believable character. You can sell the character in a game or film or whatever media piece you're doing with secondary motion. So it really brings a really extra special touch to your character. Okay, I'm going to go through a couple more examples. Let's take a look. Okay, so here's another example. Now in this example we have this great amusing looking character over here, this monster character. There is some secondary motion on some of the sections of the character. I've left them in, but I've also intentionally removed secondary motion specifically on the 2 hands and the tail, and we're going to go through the exercise of adding secondary motion. All right? Okay, so let's try a couple things. Let's say you wanted to do secondary motion on the tail, and I wanted to do it at the end. Okay, so let's do the thing we did before, which is from the previous tutorial. We're going to select all the bones, the chain of bones on the tail, and we're going to install a bend physics, and let's see what we get. Okay, so well, let me just turn off the gravity. If you don't want it to wobble at the start, typically you turn off the gravity, and then you can get, you know, a non-wobbling state at the start. Okay, so you get some secondary motion on the tail. It actually is kind of cool, but we can probably amplify this a bit. What do I mean by that? Well, as we mentioned before, secondary motion is driven by primary motion, right? You need a primary action that's driving it. Right now, this primary motion is driving. This secondary motion is the up, down, move, bounce gait of this monster. And that might not be enough to accentuate this motion. You might want something more dramatic, right? So you might say, this is not enough. So what do I do? Well, let's come in here, let's remove these motors first that we did. So there's no secondary motion on the tail. And here's what we're going to do. Here's a typical trick, and this is a typical 2-step process that I encourage you guys to do as well. If you want to amplify the secondary motion on, say, a dangly tail or flesh or whatever, what you do first, very important, is you install a rotate cycle motor or move bounce, whatever you want to call it, at the base of your chain. Okay, so let's do that. So let's select this bone, click install motor, and then we will search for rotate cycle motor. Okay, So we play it, it's kind of ridiculous because the angles are too large. So we'll reduce it. We'll reduce it to say 5 and -5. Okay? Okay, and maybe increase the speed so it's in sync with the character, right? Something like this. Okay, so now you have more of a rotational driving action in the base chain of the tail, and we're going to do the secondary motion now. We're going to select the next bolt in the chain, Ctrl+M, install motor, bend physics, and we'll turn off the gravity. Okay, so now you can see the tail is more pronounced, and we can actually say, let's say, increase the damping. Let's see what we get. Okay, so there you go. Now you actually get a more interesting, much more accentuated effect, and we can increase the angles that the tail rotates very easily, and that will also increase the amount of secondary motion you have, because the rotate cycle is, again, the primary driver of the secondary motion, right? So I can say I can decrease the stiffness on the tail, and now you get even more dramatic wobbly motion. But you can see where we're going. You typically want to install a major driving component to drive your secondary motion, so you get this really nice wavy follow-through effect. How much you want to drive is up to you, but I will encourage, in general, a tip is to have some kind of oscillatory motor at the base chain of the dangly bone chain you want to have secondary motion on. So you typically put a rotate cycle or move bounce motor on it, and then you put bend physics at the end of the tail to get this secondary effect, right? So let's do the same exercise for the hands as well. So we're going to select the base bone on the hands, and we are going to click rotate cycle, and we're going to limit the angles, set the speed, same thing here, rotate cycle, okay, and set the angles and the speed. So now we have, say, okay, and then we can also change the phase just to make it slightly out of phase, so it's more interesting that the hands don't move in unison, because that's kind of strange. Yeah. Okay, and then finally we add the secondary motion onto the rest of the hands, right? So let's turn off the gravity, and same thing here as well. Bend physics, turn off the gravity. Okay. And we can also increase the damping. So we're playing with a couple of parameters here just to accentuate the motion. We can decrease the stiffness, might be too stiff. Let's see what we get here. There you go. So now you actually have more wobbly hands. And again, you can tweak how wobbly you want the hands are. Let me turn off the bones. And so now you have this really subtle idle motion going on with the character, which is really cool. The subtle motion is actually more difficult. Subtle secondary motion is actually more complex and difficult in many cases to animate than very, very exaggerated poses or motions. So that's a tip, again, for a use case for secondary motion. You can use it to animate very interesting idle animations, and you typically want some kind of oscillatory motor at the base of the chain to start that secondary motion, because it really brings it to life. Okay, I'm going to go through a couple more examples, so keep watching. Okay, so here is another example. Here is a Kraken character. As you can see, we've already applied all the usual secondary effects we spoke about in the previous example. So we have, rotate cycle motors driving the base bend physics motion on the character, and it's all doing its magic, as we learned from the previous tutorials. Now, so that's kind of cool, but I'm going to teach you a couple more tricks in this example. So let's start with a base animation with no animation, okay? And let's say you're actually going to be animating the tentacles in a directable way. So you're not actually doing idle motion. You want to actually direct the tentacles. Now, there's a couple ways you can do it. Obviously, you can. One of the most powerful ways, actually, in Creature is you can actually just draw. Let me just select the chain of bones. You can select the chain of bones and just draw a pose, like so, right? You can draw a pose. It's really cool. You can draw a pose to actually pose your tentacles. Okay, so that's kind of cool. So that's, you can keyframe these over time, for example, right? So if I can keyframe these, but of course doing this for directable motion is great, but what if you wanted something more, right? So I am going to again clear all the animation. Okay, and what if, this is another trick, is I can actually use a very powerful motor in Creature called the pin rope motor, and it's actually going to run some pretty complicated physics to solve for motion that allows you to both direct the overall target position, but also gives you secondary dynamics. So let's start with this position over here, and if I go to frame 10, let's say I stretch a tentacle here. Okay, let's see what happens. You see that? That's pretty cool, huh? And so you can actually keyframe. You can keyframe these posers. So I can come into frame, say frame 21, and I can move it back here as well. So let's see what happens. You can see you get this nice secondary jiggle effect, right? It's really cool. It's almost like a follow-through effect, but it still sort of tracks your motion, which is magical. And so you can use something like a pin rope motor to actually generate secondary motion when you're trying to direct motion, direct your actually primary motion, which is really, really cool. You can also change how much it stretches. This is where stretch stiffness becomes important. So I can up, say, the stretch stiffness to 100 to prevent it from stretching that much, right? So these are the different parameters you can play with. So let's take it down to 70 to see what we get. So depending on the type of action you're going for, you can basically play around with these physical parameters. Okay, if I up the stiffness, it will actually revert and try to preserve its shape a lot more. So I encourage you to play around with these parameters to see what you get. I can also play with the damping, right? So you get this nice follow-through fleshy effect by simply keyframing your target position, right? And Creature will solve for the rest. So that's a very nice and easy way to get secondary effects from long tentacle chains by using the pin rope motor. So that's another tip for you. Okay, and let's clear this animation now. Let's clear this animation. Let's remove. Okay, so there's nothing here. Now I can do another thing too. Let's say I want to do it the traditional keyframe way without installing motors. Can I get secondary action as well? You can. In fact, you can. So I'm going to start with the tentacle here. I'm going to go to, say, frame 10 again. I'm going to rotate the tentacle. Okay, so very simple animation, nothing fancy, just doing that. And now let's say I want to apply secondary effects to these guys over here, but I don't want to install a physics motor. Is that possible? Yes, you can. So click on Animate. Go to Motion Enhance, and then there's something called Physics Motion, and you can optionally check on and off stable end. It gives you different effects. Stable end is obviously more stable, but I'll uncheck it right now because I want something more exaggerated. And then you set the start and end time. So what this does is it will actually simulate the physics, but then write it back for you into keyframes, right? So click Run. Let's see what we get. Ah, there you go. So you see how the physics is simulated, right? So the base was driving it, and then Creature solved for the base secondary motion. Now that's obviously a bit too exaggerated, so I can repeat the process again. So I can up the damping. Same parameters apply, but now it's sort of in reverse. You can actually control and get them written out into keyframes however you want. So I can up the stiffness to, say, 150. Let's see what we get. See, there you go. It's a lot more controlled now, and you can see where this is going, right? So if I undo this again, and I want even more damping, I go back again to motion enhance, physics motion. Let's up the damping to 35. And you can also change the detail. So what is detail? Well, it's going to write the keyframes back into you as animation splines. If you set the detail to really high, the splines will be very detailed. Very low, it will try to simplify the animation spline. So it depends on how many knots you want in the system. The system will take care of the rest for you. I typically set it to the center as average detail. All right, so it's a manageable number of knots, as you can tell from here. So let's play it again and see what we get. Okay, maybe too much damping. So let's try this again. Animate, motion enhance, physics motion. Let's try 28 and see what we get. Take the damping down. Okay, so a nice slightly wobbly effect on secondary motion, but not too much. It's again directed by pure FK, pure keyframes, and actually everything is again written back into keyframes as well. If we were to take a look at any of the FK bones over here and look at the animation spline, you can see you get the full spline over the entire timeline, which is probably what you want if you're doing more traditional animation, not procedural, right? And you just want to actually tweak these values manually. And you can do that with Creature as well. Creature does not actually limit you in any way or any form to use motors. You can actually just directly animate with pure FK or IK and then install, or rather not install, and then run a motion enhanced pass on the bones you want secondary motion on. And that will also give you the same result, but sort of more direct in reverse, so you can actually directly modify those keyframes. Okay, so that's the next tip. Okay, and then we're going to cover soft body dynamics next, so stay tuned. Okay, so we have this amazing character by OTK Games over here for their game The Vagrant. I encourage you guys to check it out if you haven't. It's on Steam on early access. Now, for this character over here, we have again applied all the usual tricks. We have the band physics on the cap of the character. We have, you know, band physics again on some of the flesh of the character. We have some subtle breathing motion using move bounce motors. Oh, and one more tip, if you want to see how your character is actually rigged, click on the anim rig graph, and you can then see in particular how many motors are installed on the system, how it's actually structured. You can see this band physics on a couple of them, and you have IK and move bounce and whatnot. You can also switch to the bone hierarchy, and you can see how the motors and bones are grouped accordingly. You can also actually select by just, you know, highlighting and zooming in and whatnot, selecting from this view. So it's very, very, very useful. Okay, anyway, so back to the original. Now we have this character over here. You can say, well, that's enough secondary motion. Yes, there is, but we can liven it up even more. Let's see how we're going to do it. So we have what we've done in the previous examples is we have installed physics motors on primarily the bones, and we're playing around with techniques to sort of give you secondary motion with those physics motors. But again, they're primarily on the bones, and the bones drive the mesh of the character. You can also directly install physics, or what we call soft body dynamics, soft body physics on the character itself to give you a squishy, deformable effect, and this is typically used for any kind of flesh or cloth motion. So let's select the body of this character, and we're going to click install motor in the regions tab, okay, and we select physics motor. So it's going to deform it using soft body dynamics. Now the first time you install it and you play it, it's going to fall off the system. It's going to fall under gravity because nothing is constrained. That's fine. Go back in and select the body, and now click edit motor. So now we are in the soft body dynamics editing mode, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to say set some radius, and I'm going to actually click and paint, just paint over this mesh over here. Okay, so the white regions are basically the regions which are glued. They will be directly tracking the animation, and the regions which are not painted are basically regions which will be allowed to flop naturally under with the soft body dynamics. So the system is going to solve for all these constraints. It's actually quite intricate, but you don't have to worry about that. You just need to tell the system which parts follow the animation and which parts don't. Click on finish editing, and let's see what we get. Aha, so now you can see there's actually more of a wobble effect coming in, right? Because that's actually soft body dynamics. Now I can actually decrease the stiffness. So if I take it down to 100, you're going to get a ridiculous effect. But let's see what we get. So it's a bit too loose, right? So the system wobbles too much. So you should obviously increase it to a much higher value. But then you see at 800, you get this nice, compelling, rotational twisty effect that you don't actually get if you were just to do it with bones alone. I can also up the damping to make it bleed energy faster. You can go nuts with it. Oh, that's a bit too much. Let's try, I don't know, 20. Let's see what we get. Okay, so now at 20, you can see that the system bleeds energy a lot faster, and so the flesh doesn't wobble as much, but it still gives you a very heavy molasses type look, right? So you can see how powerful this already is. You typically have a hard time replicating these sorts of motions in, say, just bone physics motors themselves. And if you have issues with that, you can go to the next level and install a soft body physics motor directly on the region mesh itself, and that should give you even more dynamics, right? So let's see what we can get with the cap here as well. Again, physics motor falls under gravity, that's fine, and we are going to paint again parts of it. And okay, finish editing. Okay, so you can see now it's a bit more wobbly. It's actually rotating about the targeted positions, right? Which is kind of cool, but if you don't like that sort of effect, you probably want to paint more of the mesh out, glue more parts of the mesh. Okay, so that's pretty cool. And so now you can see the motion's even more exaggerated, and how exaggerated you want it to be is entirely your choice, right? So again, I can up the damping, say 15, if I don't want it that exaggerated, but you can see you can get this really nice hit impulse, like two hit impulse thing going, which you didn't even get previously with just the bone physics motors themselves, and that I think is rather amazing. So this is a combination of bend physics motors and the soft body dynamics playing in unison together to give you a very cool dynamic effect that you have a hard time reproducing in any other system. Right? So I hope you enjoyed this rather lengthy but very useful tutorial on secondary motion. We've gone through the whole plethora of techniques. We started from the basics of the bend physics motor, and then we said we could add in base driving motion like rotate cycles or move balance motors to accentuate the motion. We also showed you more techniques to directly write secondary motion into FK keyframe poses using the motion enhance tool, and we can also use stuff like pin rope physics to directly drive physics motion to give you very lifelike tentacle action or any kind of rope type action. And finally, to add additional secondary effects on top of your current bone secondary effects, we can also add in what we've done here, which is the soft body dynamics in meshes themselves. You can paint regions to glue them to specific parts of the animation and then let the system drive the rest of it to give you this really fluid, lifelike behavior. So I hope you enjoyed watching this tutorial, and I hope you can use a lot of this knowledge in a lot of your creature animation assets. So happy animating, and thanks for watching.